everyone again. We're going to look at two concepts, prejudice and discrimination. Actually, I'm going to move beyond prejudice and discrimination to a reference and an understanding of race because we want to see how things like racism is connected really to prejudice and discrimination. And I have sort of two questions that guiding us as we going around. What is the difference between prejudice and discrimination? And secondly, let's look and see why it happens and how it happens. We are going to deal with this in a little more depth in this session and in the following session, okay? But for the moment, let's look at the two terms. To have a prejudice about someone is to prejudge a person based on a stereotype or assumption. So, for example, there are many people who assume that if you are dressed shabbily, etc., you may be poor. And as you can guess, it is quite possible that someone who has a lot of wealth and power and privilege decides that they are going to dress in a certain way so as not to draw attention to their power or wealth and privilege. So the prejudice allows people to prejudge and even treat that person. I remember an interview that I saw on television with Barack Obama about the time when he was a senator in Chicago. He said one of the first receptions he went to valet parking, and a gentleman who had come out of the car before, seeing him, actually asked him to park his car. So based again on the assumption that, if he's a young black male in a setting such as that, obviously he was meant to be one who would park the cars. The important thing to realize is that we all have prejudices. We all do that kind of making assumptions about people and about character. Um, you should try to think of times, in fact, when you have done so. It's something that is all natural. Most of us, we have the prejudices, but we don't sort of translate that usually into discrimination, and I'll talk about that. Perhaps because we don't have the power to do so. But very often the problem is that if you are capable of prejudice and you do have the power to do so, you could always translate that into discrimination, okay? Um, Several years ago, I came upon this article written by a teacher. It was about multiculturalism. Um, and the teacher had asked this question: to what extent do we make assumptions about our students on the basis of their background, socioeconomic status, language differences, physical appearance, health status, and cultural factors? Clearly we do. And she asked to what extent. And the reason that she's asking to what extent is because they can actually influence the outcomes of schooling and the experience of schooling and the experience of society for many of these young people. For example, the question of accent, everybody has an accent, but some accents have a little bit more recognition and power and authority than others. And usually people, when they hear certain accents, make a connection between that and a certain deficit. You feel that people who have this accent obviously don't know as much as people who come from places where perhaps you have a Western European accent, etc. So that's one of the things that happens, especially in terms of languages, because we have a situation with immigrants, for example, not being able to find jobs based on assumptions made about the limitations of their character, their ability to do so, their training, their education. So that's a big one. So language differences, physical appearance, health status, and all of this, you see, is significant and important because, as I say here, the problem with prejudice is that it leads to discrimination. When fears and biases result in individuals being stereotyped, discrimination often occurs. I am not going to deal too much with it here but you can see how easily prejudice leads to discrimination. And I'm going to give you one such example about the assumptions made about people based on who they are. We can see very, very clearly in our society as it exists now the problems that a lot of our native First Nations people face. And those problems are a direct consequence of the kind of prejudices and biases that have built up through the process of colonization and colonialism, etc. And as a consequence, people are still being judged based on those biases and still being discriminated against in terms of employment, in terms of their rights, etc. For more on, the whole notion of discrimination and how it works, I recommend strongly going to the Ontario Human Rights website. There's lots of information there. It is says that discrimination is treating somebody differently because of their race, disability, sex, or other personal characteristics. So it gives you a broad outline, and then it goes on to talk about different kinds of discrimination: direct, indirect, systemic, etc. Okay, so it's very, very useful website for you to go to. I'm going to go to it again and recommend it again in a short while. But there is a lot there that, very, very useful for your purposes, okay? So we go to look and understand what discrimination leads to. And this discrimination can lead to some very, very harmful forms of oppression, such as racism. Racism is a good example of what the consequences of discrimination, because the practice of racism, in fact, supports unfair or unequal treatment of individuals as well as entire groups. I talked about First Nations people. We talk about young black people. For example, in the criminal justice system here in Canada, we have more visible minority youth, especially indigenous peoples. We have native youth. Native people represent 22% of the prison population, despite the fact that they're only 4% of the general population. So there is some sort of unequal treatment. What it means is, yes, they commit the crimes, but they're perhaps more policed, under more surveillance. When they do commit crimes, obviously they are caught more often, and not only that, because of the socioeconomic situation under which they live, they probably do not have fixed address or money, for example. All of those things that in Canada we use in place of bail. They want to make sure that when your case comes up, that you can be called. So it just tells you that it has actual consequences for a lot of people, all based on the notion of discrimination. Again, the Ontario Human Rights website deals a lot with the different kinds of racism. You might want to go to it. There is an article written by Francis Henry that's quite good. There is a definition of race. Races are defined as populations differing in the incidence of certain genes but actually exchanging or potentially able to exchange genes across the boundaries. That's racist. But racism is a very, very different kind of situation, all right? And it's good for us here as we continue on to understand the difference, what it is. There are various types of racism. When I tell people this, they're usually surprised. So let's look at some of the synthesis questions that we would want to address here. Where do prejudices come from? There was one Australian educator, an early childhood educator, who actually says that, prejudices are learned as early as 3 and 4 years old in the household, from parents, from peers, from adults who perhaps use language that informs prejudice. And that, as we go along and we read things in the media, you come into contact with people, those prejudices are often affirmed based on your relationship with these groups, okay? So I think a big topic for us as adults is that since prejudice can result in discrimination and even racism, is how can adults unlearn prejudice? And I'm going to take this up in another few sessions, but I'll just mention here that we have to find ways of deconstructing how all those stereotypes, etc., come into being. Let me give you just two examples. You know, young black males are excellent basketball players. Well, if you are a young black male and you're not doing well at school, that the odds seem to be stacked against you educationally for all the various reasons that we are not going to discuss here tonight. But the whole issue of you find an opportunity that will allow you to realize your potential, so you go in that direction. So it does look as if, many young black males are in fact good basketball players. But I mean, when we look at who are the people, the Canadians, who have excelled in basketball, we know that that is just a stereotype. Okay, let's take another one. The stereotype of the drunken sort of the indigenous or First Nations person who's always drinking or on drugs, etc. You have to trace where those things come from. You have to look at the time of conquest, and you have to look at how people were given, our indigenous people were given alcohol in order, for them to sign over what was valuable to them. You realize that alcohol is a dependency, and therefore you have to look at the intergenerational, all right, factors that cause these, what looks like, a sign of being to surface, okay? So there is a relationship between prejudice and oppression. And what is the relationship between prejudice and oppression? I think you need to spend a little time thinking about that and discussing it in the tutorial, because oppression involves actually denying certain individuals and group privileges afforded to those in the rest of the community. And when you do that based on assumptions, then definitely you are oppressing. So we need to take a little bit more close look at that, and we'll do that in the next session.